The film begins in a suburban house, where we see a man named Christian carefully preparing a steak. After he's done, he splits the meal into 2 portions, placing one on a plate and the other in a metal bowl. Christian then puts the bowl on the floor and tells his dog Frank to eat. Surprisingly, it's revealed that Frank isn't an ordinary dog but a person dressed and behaving as one. Frank eagerly starts eating. Meanwhile, Christian checks his Tinder profile and scrolls through several blondes until he finds a woman named Sigrid. He finds her attractive and immediately sends her a super like. The story then follows Christian's usual day, where he looks after Frank by giving him snacks and cleaning his teeth. Soon he gets a notification that Sigrid has also liked him. Later that night, Christian sends Sigrid a message before going to sleep. In the morning, Frank wakes him up in bed with panting and sniffing noises. Amused, Christian gives him breakfast and notices that Sigrid has replied, so he starts chatting with her. They talk all day and she eventually invites him to meet. The next day, Christian dresses up in a suit for his date and asks Frank for his opinion, but Frank only whimpers. After finishing, Christian says goodbye to his human dog and leaves the house. He arrives at an upscale restaurant and waits for his date. After waiting a while, she doesn't show up, which leaves him frustrated. Just as he's about to leave, Sigrid arrives in sweatpants. She apologizes for being late, and they begin a casual chat. However, Sigrid suddenly starts using her phone, which seems rude to him. He wonders if it's important, but she apologizes, saying it's just a habit. Sigrid then reveals she's a student and works part-time as a cashier. When she asks what he does, Christian nervously admits that he's currently unemployed. He also shares that he's a bit reserved and finds it hard to connect with people, unlike her, who appears outgoing. As night falls, Christian gathers his courage to invite Sigrid to his place. She agrees, and when they arrive, she's impressed by the luxurious home, realizing Christian is not a typical guy. Christian pours her wine and explains his parents passed away, leaving him the house. Sigrid, in turn, reveals her parents divorced when she was young, so they're not close. Christian then mentions he has a dog. Sigrid is excited and asks about the breed, but Christian says it's complicated and that she'll understand when she meets him. Meanwhile, Frank is listening from the door. As they keep talking, Christian suddenly kisses her, and they become intimate while Frank eerily watches. The next morning, Sigrid wakes to see Frank in front of her, which terrifies her, but Christian acts like everything is normal. Disturbed by the sight of a person dressed like a dog, Sigrid asks Christian who he is, but he insists it's just his pet. Horrified, Sigrid quickly leaves, claiming she has to work. Frank tries to explain, but Sigrid ignores him and asks Christian for a ride home. At her apartment, she meets her roommate, Aurora, who asks about the date, and Sigrid has mixed feelings. She describes Christian as attractive and they connected well. However, the odd thing is that he has a person dressed in a dog costume as a pet. Shocked, Aurora asks to see a photo of him. The moment she does, she recognizes him as the son of a well-known multimillionaire. Aurora is astonished her friend went on a date with such a wealthy man. Sigrid is also surprised as she didn't know. The two friends watch a YouTube video about puppy play, where people dress and act like dogs. Sigrid finds it strange, but Aurora argues that people can do as they like if it's harmless. She advises Sigrid not to let this handsome millionaire go because of her biases. Reflecting on her friend's advice, Sigrid gets a call from Christian, who wants to make things right. She apologizes for leaving so suddenly, and Christian assures her it's his fault for not explaining earlier. To make it up to her, he invites her to dinner at his place the next day and she happily agrees. The following day we see Aurora and Sigrid studying, though Sigrid seems distracted. Sigrid shares that she and Christian have made up, and he's invited her to dinner. This excites Aurora, who jokes that if Sigrid marries him, she could live off his wealth and never study again. Soon after, Christian arrives to pick her up, and they head to his place. During dinner, Sigrid asks about the human dog, so Christian explains that, while it may look strange, it's entirely Frank's choice to live this way. He has no one else and wants Christian to care for him. Sigrid empathizes and asks if she can meet Frank. Christian agrees but warns her to treat him as a real dog, not a person. Though nervous, Sigrid decides to try, petting him gently. However, Frank jumps into her lap like an excited dog and sniffs her, making Sigrid uncomfortable. Christian scolds Frank and tells him to step back. Christian feels upset about the situation and offers to take Sigrid home, but she decides to stay and accept the unusual scenario. Sigrid then asks how he met Frank, so Christian shares they met in childhood and were both loners. He technically had friends because of his expensive toys and treats, but once those were gone, only Frank stayed, becoming his true friend. Sigrid spends the night again, and in the morning Christian surprises her with breakfast in bed. Soon after, he brings Frank in, saying the dog wants to apologize for his behavior. Sigrid is a little uneasy but forgives him. Realizing she's late for class, Christian drives her to college. Later, Aurora invites Sigrid to hang out, but Sigrid declines, saying she has plans with Christian. Aurora advises her not to be too easy, noting that rich guys like him are used to getting what they want. When Sigrid sees Christian later, he shows her his mother's old book collection. Remembering her friend's advice, Sigrid asks him to take her home as it's getting late, but Christian insists she stay, and she eventually agrees. Later, Christian tells her about Frank's difficult past and that no one else has been there for him. He admits he doesn't fully understand why Frank chose this lifestyle but supports him anyway. Christian then suggests a trip to the countryside with Frank, and Sigrid agrees. The next morning, Aurora teases Sigrid about playing hard to get, and they hug before Sigrid leaves for the trip. The three of them leave the city and head to a beautiful forest house. Sigrid is amazed by the surroundings and decor. But during dinner, she scrolls through her phone, which annoys Christian. He suggests spending the weekend together without distractions. Though hesitant, Sigrid hands over her phone, which he locks away. Later, we see Sigrid and Frank playing in the living room as Christian watches happily, then heads to the kitchen for wine. During this time, Sigrid is shocked by something she learns, just as Christian returns with the wine. Overwhelmed, she says she's tired and goes to bed upstairs. Sigrid wakes up early the next morning and sees Christian still asleep. She quietly heads downstairs and tries to leave, only to find the door locked. Sigrid searches for the keys but is caught by Christian, who explains he always locks the door for safety. When he asks what she's doing, she nervously says she wanted some fresh air, so Christian takes her outside. Sigrid asks for her own key, saying she doesn't want to wake him, but he explains there's only one and assures her he doesn't mind. He then kisses her, and Sigrid feels so disgusted that she vomits when she gets home. At breakfast, Christian notices her discomfort. She doesn't eat and asks for her phone. Christian refuses at first, but when she mentions her mother's illness, he reluctantly brings the phone and calls her mom himself, putting it on speaker. Poor Sigrid feels forced to nervously start talking. Through their conversation, it quickly becomes clear that her mom is healthy. Christian expresses disappointment with Sigrid for lying. He thinks she's addicted to her phone and takes it away again. Soon after, Sigrid asks Christian if she can walk Frank. He agrees without hesitation, and the two head into the forest. After a while, Sigrid asks Frank if she should remove his leash so he can walk freely, but he tells her to be quiet, as Christian might be watching them. Frank asks if she has a plan, and Sigrid suggests running away. Frank warns that Christian is prepared for this and says their only escape is to kill him. This shocks Sigrid, and she insists she'd never do that. Shortly after, they return home, and Christian notices that Frank hasn't used the bathroom. Christian takes him outside himself, giving Sigrid the chance to grab a kitchen knife, which she hides under her pillow. But moments later, Christian appears unexpectedly, saying he wants to change the sheets. Nervous, Sigrid offers to do it herself, noting that he usually handles all the housework. Christian hesitates, expecting perfection, but ultimately agrees. Afterward, she heads to shower, but Christian calls her, wanting to talk. Sigrid fears he found the knife, but instead he criticizes her for a wrinkle in the sheet, though he soon laughs it off. He then starts kissing her, attempting to get intimate. Sigrid resists, saying she's wet, but he persists, leading her to slap him in anger. Embarrassed, Christian retreats to prepare dinner. At dinner, things are tense. Sigrid compliments the wine and asks about Frank, to which Christian replies that he's asleep. When she tries to stand, she suddenly feels dizzy and collapses, and Christian carries her to bed. Sigrid wakes up early the next morning and anxiously searches for the knife, only to realize it's missing. Just then, Christian wakes up and says he wants to show her something. He takes her downstairs, playing a recording of her conversation with Frank and pulling out the knife, saying he's disappointed. He reveals he didn't tie her up because he still trusts her. He then takes her to a back room where Frank is in a cage, admitting that Frank confessed everything after being confronted. He warns Sigrid that, unlike Frank, she will face punishment for betrayal. Christian then opens the cage, removes Frank's mask, and praises him as a good dog. Seizing the opportunity, Frank bites Christian and a struggle ensues. Seeing this, Sigrid grabs the keys and escapes, fleeing into the forest while screaming for help. Christian nearly chokes Frank but releases him after he promises not to resist. However, Christian soon realizes Sigrid has escaped. Frank apologizes, but this only angers Christian more. He scolds Frank for talking like a human and decides to punish him. He drags Frank to the barn, ties him to a chair, blindfolds him and places headphones over his ears. He then douses Frank in water and covers his head with a plastic bag, nearly suffocating him. Meanwhile, Sigrid, lost in the forest, collapses and cries. Back in the barn, Christian finally removes the bag, then locks Frank in a cage and puts on the headphones himself, playing loud music through speakers in the barn. He yells at Frank, demanding he start barking. Hearing the music, Sigrid feels bad for Frank and, gathering her courage, returns to help him. She grabs a large piece of wood and prepares to confront Christian. Meanwhile, Christian moves to a new punishment, slapping Frank repeatedly. Sigrid arrives and, horrified by the abuse, strikes Christian hard on the head, causing him to collapse. Taking advantage, Sigrid tries to help Frank escape. Severely weakened, Frank can barely stand, but Christian soon regains consciousness and knocks both of them out. Overwhelmed with frustration, he collapses, crying. Time passes and we see Christian preparing breakfast at the forest house. Frank is no longer given regular food. Christian takes him a bowl in his cage. He then heads to the barn where Sigrid is now his nude pet, dressed in a dog costume and fully compliant. He feeds her and promises that good behavior will allow her to sleep inside the house. Christian then returns home and lets a dog out of its cage, preparing a third bowl of food. Moments later, a baby in a dog costume crawls in eating from the bowl, and this is where the movie ends.